Welcome to Grace Fellowship Baptist Church Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, January 11th, 2023. We are in 1 Samuel chapter 29. Let's start in verse 1. The Philistines gathered all their forces at Aphek, and Israel camped by the spring of Jezreel. As the Philistines' rulers marched with their units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were marching at the rear with Achish. The commanders of the Philistines asked, "What about these Hebrews?" Achish replied, "Is this not David, who is an officer of Saul, king of Israel? He has already been with me for over a year, and from the day he left Saul until now, I have found no fault in him." But the Philistine commanders were angry with him and said, "Send the man back. He may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting. How better could he regain his master's favor than taking the heads of our own men? Isn't this the David they sing about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." So Achish called David and said to him, "As surely as the Lord lives, you have been reliable, and I would be pleased to have you serve with me in the army. From the day you came to me until now, I have found no fault in you, but the rulers don't approve of you. Turn back and go in peace. Do nothing to displease the Philistine rulers." "But what have I done?" asked David. "What have you found against your servant from the day I came to you until now? Why can't I go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" Achish answered, "I know that you have been pleasing in my eyes as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the Philistine commanders have said, 'He must not go up with us into battle.' Now get up early, along with your master's servants who have come with you, and leave in the morning as soon as it is light." So David and his men got up early in the morning to go back to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. David finally gets a chance to go to war, and the Philistine commanders won't have it. Achish finds no problem with it. David has been doing an exemplar job of exactly what he should be doing, making raids and this kind of thing. And he's been with Achish for over a year and 4 months. And Achish has no problem with him. He's been making raids, he's been getting supplies, he has been getting wealth and paying his taxes and making a living, and his men have been farming and helping in raids and not getting injured. And Achish finds him to be an excellent uh, warrior and his men. He's looking forward to seeing how he can do in battle. And God is working things out so David is not committing sin against his own people. And the Philistine commanders just don't trust him. They understand that this is the man that has been credited with tens of thousands of Philistine deaths. And that he's had falling out with Saul. They're not concerned about that. That doesn't mean that he's safe. He could be working for himself to defeat the Philistine army from inside and then take over the Jewish kingdom, the Israelite kingdom. And they don't understand and they don't know, but they don't trust. And I think it's God that's putting that distrust in their heart, because God knows what's fixing to happen the next day. And if David was on the Philistine battlefield, the Israelites wouldn't trust him anymore either. As it is, he's not going to be fighting the Israelites. The Philistines are going to kill Saul. David's going to get to be king. And God's working all this out. And David has been safe for a year and 4 months, and Saul has been getting worse. And yeah, David's been getting wealthy, as a king needs to be. He started out a poor man, a shepherd, the youngest of a large family. His dad may have been wealthy, but the youngest is going to inherit the least. The older brothers are going to have an opportunity. Well, the oldest one's going to inherit the birthright, double portion, and the older ones are going to get a chance to get involved in business and make a living for themselves and make their own money even before dad dies. The youngest is going to be the one that uh, gets the least opportunity just because he's youngest. And God needs David to be a wealthy, influential man. And so God has given him an opportunity to be wealthy, to learn good battle tactics, etc., to continue to clear out the Amalekites and the others that God had told the Israelites to clear out, and they haven't yet. God has put David in a position where he's continued to obey God, no matter where he is, and to acquire the wealth and the influence and the ability that when he gets to a chance to be king, to be a successful king. And now God uses the Philistine distrust to make sure he's not on the battlefield when he shouldn't be. Sure, David expresses outrage, but he is obedient. He's obedient to his commanders, and so he turns around and heads back to Ziklag. Chapter 30, verse 1. David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and the Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women, all who were in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. Now that's an odd statement. The Amalekites normally captured slaves, but if somebody wasn't fit to work as a slave, they killed them. There's no point carrying the old around. They're not useful slaves. They were just being retaliatory, kidnapping everybody. They knew who was killing them. It was David and his men out of Ziklag. And they were hoping to engage David in battle and win, and if not, to at least destroy his stuff and take all his people and dishearten him. And so they kidnapped everybody, including the old. They were hoping some of those old folks that they had with them would be valuable trading people, somebody like his parents, say, who was fortunately not in Ziklag. And they would be somebody valuable enough in the community that they could trade valuable goods or captives or somebody with. It's a different strategy than the Amalekites normally used. And they hit Ziklag and captured everybody, took the goods, and left. They're trying to make it back to their territory where it's easy to defend before David gets there. And they may have gotten intelligence that he was going out to battle and he would be with the Philistines. And sometimes those kind of battles could last a month or more. So they may have done their reconnaissance and known and hoping to get back home and sell the captives and create a real headache for David. not knowing that God was going to turn him around and send him back home. And he'd be 3 days behind him. And David and his men are going to be mad. Verse 3. When David and his men came to Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their women and sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. David's 2 wives had been captured, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God. Then David said to Abithiar the priest, son of Ahimelech, "Bring me the ephod." Abithiar brought it to him, and David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them?" "Pursue them," he answered. "You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue." David and the 600 men with him came to the Besor ravine, where some stayed behind, for 200 men were too exhausted to cross the ravine. But David and the 400 men continued the pursuit. They found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David. They gave him water to drink and food to eat, part of a cake of pressed figs and 2 cakes of raisins. He ate and was revived, for he had not eaten any food or drank any water for 3 days and 3 nights. So David is on the pursuit, and he has military men, and they have reason to travel fast. And they are traveling as fast as they can. They don't have a lot of provisions. They had expected to have the Philistines provide for them, and they only had what they could carry. They expected to get home and be able to find provisions, and the Amalekites have stolen everything. And they get part of the way, and there's this fairly steep ravine, and 1/3 of the men, 200 men, are just too famished, too tired, too exhausted to go down the ravine, back up the other side, and keep running. And so David has them camp there and see if they can get enough local food and water in the ravine and sustain themselves and guard his rear. And then he and the 400 men that are still fit travel on. Now, he was in grave distress, so were the other men, and they had this idea of stoning David. They were angry. They had to take it out on somebody. And he consulted God. Had the priest bring the ephod. He consulted God, and he got an answer to pursue them, that he would overtake them, that he would win. And on that, the strength of that, 600 angry men head out with very little provisions, and they get part of the way. They have to leave part of them. They continue on. And then they finally get a break. They find an Egyptian. The Amalekites had captured a slave from somewhere else and left him behind. And we're fixing to find out why. And David and his men found the Egyptian. They want to know what's going on. They give the Egyptian some food, what they had, and helped him recover. He needed food and water, and they gave him food and water, and he recovered. Verse 13, David asked him, "To whom do you belong, and where do you come from?" He said, "I am an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me when I became ill 3 days ago. We raided the villages in the Negev of the Kerethites and the territory belonging to Judah and the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag." David asked him, "Can you lead me down to this raiding party?" He answered, "Swear to me before God that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master, and I will take you down to them. So David's interrogating him, finds out that yes, he's on the right track. He's chasing the right people. He's and he's got a slave of an Amalekite who doesn't value human life. The slave got sick and he just left him in the desert. Didn't leave him provisions, assumed he was going to die, and it didn't matter. The Egyptian doesn't really want to go back to the Amalekites. He doesn't want to be a slave. And all he's asking David is, hey, don't turn me over, and I will lead you to them. And you are obviously a man of war chasing these Amalekites, and if you get them, fine. They didn't treat me right. I don't care about them. They don't care about me. And he's not asking much. He doesn't even ask to be freed. I mean, he could have asked to be freed and released back to Egypt. He just asked that he not be returned to this master that clearly does not care about him. And that was fairly typical. Verse 16, he led David down, and there they were, scattered over the countryside, eating, drinking, and reveling because of the great amount of plunder they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from Judah. David fought them from dusk until the evening of the next day, and none of them got away except 400 young men who rode off on camels and fled. So the Egyptian takes him down. They find the group. He knows where they're going, how to get there. He knows the path. David doesn't have to track through the wilderness. He can now run at this pace that fighting men who are angry can go. And they show up at dusk when they're having a big party. And they have the element of surprise. And probably a lot of the Amalekites are drunk and definitely overeaten. They think they're wealthy. And David and his men fall to vengeance with a gusto. And for a whole 24 hours, they attack the Amalekites and kill every Amalekite except for 400 men who realized we're losing it. We got to outrun David. They came in on foot. Let's get on our camels and go. And they were camel people. And so they got on camels and left. The camels could have taken a whole lot, but the less you put on the camel, the faster it can run, and the longer it can run. And they were trying to outrun very bloodthirsty Israelites and get home with their life. And so they didn't pack up anything. They just got on their camels and fled. And David and his men let the 400 Amalekites go. They'd achieved their major objective, getting their people back. And they got a lots of goods. Verse 18, David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken, including his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder or anything else they had taken. David brought everything back. He took all the flocks and the herds, and his men drove them ahead of the other livestock, saying, "This is David's plunder." When David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow him and who were left behind at the Besor ravine, they came out to meet David and the people with him. As David and his men approached, he greeted them, but all the evil men and troublemakers among David's followers said, "Because they did not go out with us, we will not share with them the plunder we recovered. However, each man may take his wife and children and go. David replied, No, my brothers, you must not do that with what the Lord has given us. He has protected us and handed over to us the forces that came against us. Who will listen to what you say? The share of the man who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as the share of him who went down to the battle. All will share alike. David made this a statute and ordinance for Israel from that day to this. So what David does in apparently a spur of the moment decision, the more greedy of the bunch thought, because they fought and they took risk and the 200 were too ill to continue and take up the pursuit and they stayed behind, they could only get their families and everybody that went to battle would get wealthy. And David knows that's not how you keep group cohesion. He also knows that somebody's got to protect the luggage and the baggage and all the goods that are in camp. And that's an important role for the army. And that if things go bad, sometimes those are the guys that save you from absolutely losing, because you can call those reserves in. And it keeps the supplies you have safe. And the other army doesn't raid your supplies and leave you destitute. And that's an important role. And so he makes an ordinance that everybody that's in the army gets an equal share. That keeps morale up from everybody. It's not, I grabbed goods from a wealthier tent than you did, so I got more for taking risk in battle, and you sit over there and killed a bunch of guys, and you took a bunch more risk, but I snuck off and found the commander's tent and stole all the riches, or anything like that. He makes the army very equal, very fair, very equitable enterprise, that everybody, regardless what role they have, even typically the old men and the young men that were not fit for battle, stayed behind to protect the luggage, protect the goods. And they got an equal share because they did what they were told to do. And he made that decision. Now, in this case, it may not have been as good a decision as it sounds like, because they were left behind not to guard the baggage like most of the time they would have been, but just simply because they were not fit to go into battle anymore. And they weren't fit to climb down and climb up, so they were left behind and hoped they could forage for themselves enough to stay alive. And the 400 went on and risked their lives, when it would have been safer if everybody could have been strong enough and fought at 600 men instead of 400 men. But David also realized that he came back with 400 men. They killed a bunch of Amalekites. Only 400 Amalekites got away on 400 camels, and they got all the sheep and the goats and the cattle and any other animals that were there. They got grain, they got people, they had slaves, they had garments, they had household goods. They had a lot of stuff. A lot of it was their stuff. Some of it was the stuff from Judah. Some of it was the stuff from some of the other people around in the Negev. The Amalekites had meant to become wealthy through this raid and had thought they'd hit it rich. God had a different purpose, though. And David then goes out and succeeds in this battle. And then he makes this A very important decision that makes him a very fair king and that everybody can trust him. That everybody goes to battle, no matter their role, whether they took their life in their hands by going hand to hand combat or whether they got assigned to stay back in camp and protect camp. They get an equal share. He knew that everybody, even if they divided it 600 ways instead of 400 ways, was going to get wealthy by the standards of that day. They'd been fairly wealthy in Ziklag. It had been burned to the ground. They're going to have to rebuild it. But he doesn't want 200 discontent men and 400 content men that are going to get lazy. He wants 600 content men. And so he just decides that everybody gets to share equally and comes up with a sound reason. And they go for it because he's the leader. Verse 26, when David arrived at Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah who were his friends, saying, "Here is a present for you from the plunder of the Lord's enemies." He sent it to those who were in Bethel, Ramon, Negev, Jitter, to those who in Aroer, Sifmoth, Eshtemoa, and Rakal, to those in the towns of the Jehemelites and the Kenites, to those in Hormah, or Ashan, Ethak, and Hebron, and to those in all the other places where David and his men had roamed. He's sending these gifts basically back to the places where they were plundered from. He may have known enough about the different sheep and the different shepherds and known whose flocks he was returning. Let's face it, he'd spent some years out there, roaming around out there, trying to stay away from Saul, protecting shepherds. He had been a shepherd himself out in that area. He probably knew a lot of these people, and they were, in some senses, his friends. And he sends stuff back and sends his gift, basically saying, hey, let's be friends. He doesn't yet know what's going on with Philistines and Israelites, but he's got to make friends if he's going to keep running from Saul. He's got to make friends if he's not going to be trusted by the Philistines. And this is the second time the Philistines haven't trusted him. And basically for the same reason. He's a valiant warrior. He's credited with killing tens of thousands of Philistines. And they just don't trust him. I'm not sure I'd trust him either if I was a Philistine. He's not somebody to be trifled with. They know he'd be good in battle if he was going, but they also know he'd be really good in battle if he turned and rebelled against them. They don't want to risk that. They want a good, disciplined army that obeys them. And David is now sending the stuff that wasn't his flocks and stuff basically back to where it belongs, and says it's a gift. He's returning stolen goods, which is what the Mosaic Law says to do. And he's killed the Amalekites. Now, he's probably taken some stuff from the Amalekites, and he can keep that. He may have sent some of it other places. But he's sending it all over the place. Most of Judah received a gift from him. Here they thought this stuff was lost permanently. The Amalekites came. And David returns it. When somebody returns your stuff, How happy are you with that person? Mm, you're going to be happy with them. And he's making friends with his old friends, the shepherds of Judah. David is beginning to demonstrate great wisdom in leading people and forming politics. And God is setting him up to be very favored by the people. And God's doing the timing. David doesn't know the timing is so perfect. He doesn't know that Saul's going to die that day. He had probably died in battle already. He's the information travels slow. It's got to travel by foot. And people don't run with bad news. They run with good news. They run with joy when it's good news. But they drudge when it's bad news. So the bad news hasn't gotten to David yet. He's still sending goods out, doing his politics. God is giving him the wisdom to do it, and the ability to do it, and the wealth to do it, right when David needs the good influence. God's working this out. David just thinks he's protecting his neck from Saul. God knows he's setting up a king. David, in hindsight, will later realize God was protecting him and setting him up as king. But it's probably going to take David some while to slow down and ponder and realize and recognize. I know there's been periods in my life when it seemed like everything was coming at me and I just did the best I could to make it through, and kind of like David was through here. And it's years later when I begin to reflect back on that period of my life and realize God was working things out and organizing it. And what I couldn't see at the time was God was shaping my life and having me do exactly what he wanted me to do, just because it was the only choice left to me. And at the time, I felt very harried, very cornered, did what I had to do to keep moving. But it's what God wanted me to do. And David's in that kind of position. He's going to be exhausted mentally, physically, emotionally. Warfare, hand-to-hand warfare, is just tiring. And even after the battle's over, you're going to be exhausted, even if you know you did right and did good. And he's giving gifts, trying to curry favor with people that he's going to need to hide with again, he thinks, but actually he's going to need to be ruling. Holy Father, thank you for working David's life out so things work correctly. That you gave him Ziklag, you gave him the ability to go to make war on the Amalekites, to capture back what they had captured, to the wisdom to keep his men happy with each other and him, and to serve with wherever he tells them to serve, that they serve with distinction. Even if it seems like a menial role, they'll know that they're not given or removed from the glory, that they will be paid just as well as those who do the more glorious work. And that then you give him great wealth that he can share and set him up to be viewed as king-like by his own people, just at the time that Israel needs a king. You are an awesome God. You are the one that directs our paths. You are worthy of all praise and honor. We remember what you've done in history. And Lord, we can trust you with the future just as well, even though it's as uncertain for us as it was David in that day. In one sense, it's just as certain as it was for David in that day, even though he didn't know it. We don't know it, but we can trust you. Father, have us to trust you no matter what comes. In your holy name, amen. This is your host, Frank Reich, Associate Pastor of Family and Ministry at Grace Fellowship Baptist Church, and this has been the Wednesday evening Bible study for January 11th, 2023. This is recorded on Saturday, January 7th, 2023. Frank and I did have a good camping trip this week. We went to Bastrop State Park. I got a lot of hiking in. I haven't accounted for how far I walked. On Wednesday, I did the big walk that I meant to do. I walked about 4 miles with both dogs and then dropped Zeke off with Frankie. And Penny and I then went to Busher State Park. They share one park road between them, and they're about 12 miles apart. And Penny and I got there, and we then called Frankie, who came and picked us up. It is a beautiful hike. In 2011, there was a bad forest fire there, did a lot of damage. The forest essentially burned to the ground. Very few trees left alive. It has come back. A lot of the hills are just rolling green, 20-foot high trees as they have grown back and repopulated the land. There are places where it's still fairly barren, but even there, you can see the forest is coming back. God has a restorative effect there, and it's beautiful to see. Sure, a mature forest is much more beautiful in one sense, but it's also great to see that God, even in destruction, sets up rebuilding. Y'all have a blessed week. I hope to see you Wednesday at the Bible study. I hope to see you tomorrow at church. Oscar has some great sermons planned. And if not, I'll see you back here on YouTube. Have a blessed week.